All right, well, let's start with prayer. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for what it reveals to us about you. As we look at these stories, as we look at narratives, and as we look at historical accounts, we look at prophecies, all of it points to you. You use your people that you called through Abraham to pave the way for the one who would change us forever. And so observing that story and observing the details through the Old Testament and tracing up to the intertestamental period really paint a wonderful picture of a sovereign God who is good, who is just, who is to be trusted. So help us, Lord, as we look at your word, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So I'm really thankful that David broke up the different sections for our checkpoint meetings in at least in dividing up the exile and the return into separate meetings. So that was really, really helpful, just because once we get to this period about the return, there isn't as much scripture to cover, but there is so much history to sort of look at. And so I think that's what a lot of our time tonight is going to be, observing some historical things. And again, as I stated last time, I don't really anticipate that this is going to be some sort of breathtaking new information for you, but these reminders are always good for us when we get into reading, particularly these books. So we're coming to the portions of Scripture chronologically that follow the Jewish return from the exile. And so for tonight, at least for this checkpoint meeting, when I refer to the Jews or the Jewish nation or Israel, from this point forward, I'm talking about the return of Judah from exile. By the way, we talked about this last time, that this does not mean that the northern kingdom of Israel was completely wiped out. So we had those 10 tribes in the northern kingdom. They were not completely wiped out. There were actually many people who fled to before their downfall in 722 BC. There were many who fled to the southern kingdom, to Judah. So what we have is actually a complete representation in this return. We have a complete representation of God's chosen people, all 12 tribes who wandered in the wilderness. We have them represented in the southern kingdom at the time, specifically that Nebuchadnezzar took over, and the final exile happened in 589 BC. So it's good for us to remember, and because it's central to the return, why were the people taken into exile? And I'm not going to spend long on this, but the main reason was idolatry. And we've consistently gone back to this. And it's not funny as in funny like humor, but in a funny sense, idolatry seems to be a continuing theme through today. It may not be foreign gods that have temples and worship and sacrificial systems, but the heart behind idolatry, which is what God addresses, is a continuing theme through today, and is actually a challenge for us. But the people failed to exclusively worship Yahweh, and they gladly adopted the idolatry of the surrounding nations. And so this is an important reminder. God gave them so many chances. He really did. He gave them so many chances to repent, to return to Him. And God even gave them specific examples with using other nations. Like, remember, God used the Ninevites as an example to them. God spared the Ninevites when they repented, and they were the wicked, awful Assyrian Ninevites, a terrible people. But God did not judge them when they repented. He instead spared them at that time, but as we know, later on, they turned back again to their old ways, and God judged them. So that serves as an amazing example for the people. God has given chance after chance and examples from actual people groups to prove His willingness to spare them from exile, and also to prove His judgment if they persist. But they persisted. So enough of that. We've already covered that. Let's get to today's overview of the return from the exile. And we're covering 6 books today: Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And I'm actually going to talk through them in that order. May not be the order that you read them, but I'm going to talk through them in that order. And the best way for us to understand them is in terms of their function. How do these books relate to the Old Testament? How do they relate to the return? Where do they fall? And it's best to understand them in that way. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the historical books of this return period. So we have 3 historical books from the time of the exile through the return. And then Haggai and Zechariah, or probably better pronounced Zechariah, different than Zechariah in the New Testament. Zechariah and Malachi are the 3 prophetic books from the exile through the return. So we have 3 prophetic books. We have 3 historical books. So 3 is the magic number. Guess 3, and you're probably correct. Because the exile of Judah, actually, and we looked at this last time, the exile took place in 3 stages. 605 BC was when Nabopolassar first, remember he was king before Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar first brought people back to Babylon. And so Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they were in that first exile from Nabopolassar. And then in 597 BC and then 586 BC, we have the other 2 stages of the exile, and those were under Nebuchadnezzar. And so this took place in 3 stages. We also have 3 returns, 3 stages of return. There's a large return in 536 BC. And remember, from this point forward, really in all of our study, our numbers get smaller and smaller when we're talking in terms of dates. The largest return is in 536 BC. Then in 453 BC, we have a return led by Ezra, who we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. And then Nehemiah comes with another group, the smallest group of Jews, in 445 BC. All right, so the number 3 doesn't really carry any theological weight. We don't really, we don't need to use the number 3 as some secret code to cracking the Bible and discovering secrets. It's just that 3 it happens to be the right number for this section of Scripture. So 3 exiles, 3 returns, 3 history books, and 3 prophetic books. And so if you just think of it in that way, from the time of the exile onward, that number 3 just helps us remember things. So the order I'm going to use for this meeting is the 3 historical books first, and then we'll finish with 3 prophetic books. And I'd really like to take a short hike into the intertestamental period if we can. Hopefully we'll be able to get there with the time that we have. The intertestamental period, as you already know, is the time between the final writings in the return and the birth of Jesus. So from the last word of the book of Malachi, which is the word destruction, all the way until we see God speaking through the angel of the Lord in the book of Luke. That is what we refer to as the intertestamental period. So let's count down a little bit to the return by looking at history. And I said this is going to be very history intensive, this checkpoint meeting. We're going to be looking at a lot of dates and different things. You don't necessarily have to write everything down, but if you do, I think it will at least just help you frame some of the stuff that you read. In 626 BC, Jeremiah, that we looked at last time, began his ministry as a prophet. Remember, he was a priest before that. So he begins his ministry as a prophet, and that was really the beginning of God's last call to repentance. The last call to repentance. And in 622 BC, Ashurbanipal, who was the king of Assyria, he dies. And at that point, Assyria really falls apart. They have a short period of different kings, but no one really was like Ashurbanipal from that point forward. At the same time that was happening, the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, were rising in power. And the Assyrians fell to the Babylonians, who were led by Nabopolassar. So Ashurbanipal was Assyrian king, dies. The Babylonians rise up under Nabopolassar, and in 605 BC, Nabopolassar starts the first stage of the exile that I mentioned earlier. All right? And when we reach 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar is now king of Babylon and does the second stage of the exile. This was at the time when Jehoiachin, or Jehoiachin, however you pronounce that, was the king in Judah. He was taken into exile, and amazingly, he actually becomes friends with Nebuchadnezzar. And the way that we can see, how does that work together is really recorded for us, not their friendship, but just the change in Nebuchadnezzar is recorded in Daniel chapter 4, as Nebuchadnezzar encounters the Lord. And also, Nebuchadnezzar actually writes a portion of the book of Daniel, and we know that because he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, tells his own story. So I personally believe that you and I one day will actually get to talk with Nebuchadnezzar and meet him. The final exile occurs in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is frustrated with Judah and finally destroys Jerusalem. They've been rebelling against him over and over and over. So the walls, the temple, everything was torn down, and Nebuchadnezzar sows the city with salt so that nothing can grow there. Basically leaving it a barren wasteland. The special, precious city of Jerusalem that many of the people in the southern kingdom thought that God would never allow that to happen. But God says, I will, and then God does. In 561, so now we're getting into the exile period where they're in Babylon, the two remaining prophets that had prophesied to the people, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, both die during the exile. And that's in 561 and 560. Jeremiah dies first, and a year later Ezekiel dies. They actually died during the exile. And so from that point forward, from 560 until around 536 to 538 BC, Daniel is the only prophetic voice in Israel. Of course, he's in Babylon, where all of Israel is, pretty much, except for a few people who escaped and intermarried with the people around them, forever making themselves a hated people group. But Daniel is actually alive in 536 for the first return. But Daniel doesn't go back with the return, most likely just because of his age. At that point, he was too old to make the 5-month journey. Specifically, you can't really, from where Babylon stood, you couldn't go back in a straight line. You had to make a trek all the way around the Fertile Crescent, and so that was a little bit too much. He was probably around 90 years old. And so he doesn't go back.
Actually, not too many people went back, really, did they?
Really, it was a very small number. I think it's somewhere around, compared to what the record of people was around that, where people have calculated around 2 million people. We only have about 66 or so thousand people that end up going back. So it's a very small number, and that's in all three returns. So we have a very small number of people that actually go back to the land, which is really amazing, and actually sets the stage in our understanding for Esther, and why Esther, the story in Esther is such a big deal, because of the remaining Jews that were there. That happens during the Persian kingdom. And the fact that the Jewish people play such a significant part of the story, we'll talk about that in a little bit, is actually really affects our salvation, the outcome of that story. So it's really fascinating. But yeah, incredibly small number of people compared to the Jews that were alive. So what that tells us is that the nation as a whole is not really repentant. They kind of settle in. They like where they're at. They're content to live there. To go back to Israel was to take on a really intense burden. So if you think about it from this perspective, those who traveled back were really taking on an incredibly difficult life. They would have to rebuild the city, the temple, their dwellings. They'd have to encounter the people that were there. And on top of that, they would have to go back to an old system of temple worship, which was very complex and took a lot of effort. And I think that a lot of the people weren't willing to do that. Interestingly, it was during this period of exile that the synagogue system was established, because the people, the faithful Jews, during that time, they couldn't go back to Jerusalem for the feasts that were required, right, in the Old Testament. And since they couldn't do that, they couldn't fulfill that, there was no temple, there was no tabernacle, there was nothing, they sort of came up with a synagogue system where there were places of worship that they could flock to and collect to. And so that's actually how the synagogue system enters into Jewish tradition from that time. And goes along with what you said, because there were so many that remained in the land. But I think that the majority of the people remaining in the land were not really the traditionalist Jews, as much as that faithful, which they're not really all that faithful, as we'll see, people that go in back to Jerusalem. So what we find, really what kicks all of this off, is in 538, Cyrus decrees that the temple is to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And this is amazing. It actually is fulfilling multiple texts from different books of the Bible. We see Isaiah mentioning King Cyrus by name. And this is incredible to think of, because Cyrus is a Persian name, and the Persians weren't even in power back in the time of Isaiah. He quotes it in actually Isaiah 44. If you go and look at that passage, that's the passage where the Lord names Cyrus by name. And that prophecy is fulfilled when Cyrus decrees that the temple be rebuilt. Also, Jeremiah prophesies, the Lord speaks through Jeremiah about the people going back. And you can find that, I think it's Jeremiah 22 and 25. I don't know. I can't remember that for sure. I know I've got that somewhere in my notes. I'll find it here in a little bit to confirm those passages. But this decree fulfills Isaiah and Jeremiah, things that they said. And so there's actually, I won't really dig into this, but when you get into the world of biblical criticism, and the way that you would probably see this pop up is through like the History Channel. If you ever watch a History Channel special on biblical origins or things like that, that's where you find a lot of these biblical critics become the main voices in secular thinking. But they claim that that much of the Old Testament was written by later authors. And so you'll find this particular phenomenon explained in a sense that they would say that this was added in later by someone else to Isaiah. This was added in somewhere after the return. And the main reason that they do that is because they cannot explain, they cannot affirm that God would do something so miraculous as to state the name of the king he would use to send his people back home. So we won't really go deep into that, but the world of biblical criticism is an extremely frustrating subject. Essentially, godless people with the presupposition that most of the time that the majority of this religion is actually a cult and it's a myth. And they explain a lot of things away through their own rationalization. All right, I'm going to stop there. So this is absolutely incredible. We get that brings us to the context of Ezra when we get into the book of Ezra. Ezra occurs at the time of the return to the land. They're underneath the Persian Empire. And what we find is that Cyrus gives an amazing gift to Zerubbabel. He gives money. He gives all the temple vessels. Remember the wild party that Belshazzar threw, where there was the handwriting on the wall? All of those vessels were given back, and they were allowed to take them. And so even Cyrus even offers a guard to accompany Zerubbabel and Joshua, who was the high priest, and they refuse and say, God is going to protect us. By the way, Zerubbabel is a descendant of David. He could have been the king, but Jeremiah declared that because of the people's disobedience and because of the king's disobedience in Judah, that no one would sit on the throne of David until the Messiah. And you can actually see proof of that throughout history. There has not been a king on that throne, even to this time. They have a prime minister who is sort of, their leader, but there's not necessarily a monarchy with a king on the throne of David in the way that you see in the Bible since the last king before the exile. So what Zerubbabel does is act more as a governor. He acts more as a governor in the rebuilding of the temple. And of course, Joshua is the high priest. As they're going back to rebuild the temple, Joshua, as the high priest, gives directives for how it's to be constructed. So with his knowledge and being the high priest, he oversaw that project in that way. So they get to the land, and what they find is that people had taken up residence there, and they started living in the land. And this begins a conflict that we still see today. The conflict of, hey, this is our place. You guys can't come here, and you can't come live here. And no, this is our place. We were here first, and back and forth. That hasn't stopped, by the way. And so people say, hey, this is our place. There were a couple prominent people, Tobias and Sanballat. I know I'm not pronouncing them correctly, but those are two prominent names among others that opposed the Jews. And they started sending letters back to King Artaxerxes in Persia that starts some major tensions. This begins really, if you look at the very foundation for the conflict in Palestine today, the Palestinian conflict, Jewish conflict today, that is rooted in this sort of strange encounter with return from exile, meeting people living there with a bunch of letter writing to the kings. And that is the foundation for what is still actually going on today. That same tension continues. In 536 BC, the foundations for Zerubbabel's temple and the altar were built. So that was the start. They got the foundation done, they got the altar done, but the tensions were rising, and the letters reached King Artaxerxes, who actually sided against the Jews. And so you can see in Ezra chapter 4 a copy of King Artaxerxes' letter showing an order for the Jews to stop. They have to stop working. He basically is empathetic and says, yeah, these people, looking at history, these people are sort of ruthless. They conquer people, they take over other people, and they displace them, and they're trying to take over and displace these people who are living there, and I don't think that's right. And so I'm sure there was a lot more besides that line of thinking that went into it. But in any case, he sided with those who were inhabiting the land. So for 16 years, nothing happens. And you have this 16-year period where there is no work on the temple. It just sits there. The foundation just sits there. The altar is just sitting there. They were not utilizing it for all of the temple worship practices because the temple's not fully constructed, and so it's just sitting there. And eventually, when we get to another Persian king, Darius, sometimes I say the names out loud differently than I say them in my head. So if I say them wrong, just forgive me. He sees Cyrus's original decree, and he allows the Jews to resume building, and so they did. And his responses back to the people who were complaining and doing the letter writing was to let the people alone, let the Jewish people alone. And so finally they resume building, and it takes 4 years, and they finish it. And in 516, the temple is finished and it's dedicated. There were shouts of joy. You read in Ezra how there were shouts of joy and there were shouts of sorrow. It was so much so that it could be heard far away, I think is the way that it's stated. From a distant place, you could hear the sound. And you couldn't quite distinguish because of the loudness of it, which was more prominent, the shouts of joy or sorrow. But those who had been in Judah before, in Jerusalem, and had seen Solomon's temple with the gold and the splendor and just the magnificent size of that temple, it was so grand. There was nothing like it. Then to see, shrinking down, to see this little, it almost just seemed like a pretend temple. And it greatly troubled that older generation, those who, and I think of it this way, it wasn't just them looking at it for that first time and seeing it built that they had that sorrow. I think that built over this time as they're traveling, they make that journey, and you can just almost imagine them dreaming and talking about this temple, and remember what the temple was like, and talking about stories and talking about things they encountered there as children. And then when it's finally finished, it is the biggest disappointment of their lives, and so they weep. They weep. This is really significant. The consecration of this temple at that ceremony, there is no dramatic entrance of God. We see that in the tabernacle, right? In the tabernacle, the glory of the Lord came in, and actually the people had to get out. They had to leave because the glory of the Lord filled that. And same with Solomon's temple. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. When Zerubbabel's temple was finished, there was no dramatic entrance of God. There was no glory of the Lord filling it. In fact, we don't see any presence of God in the temple until some 500 years later when Jesus walks in. And that's when we see the glory of the Lord entering the temple. So there's, as we've already mentioned, there's Jewish life on a very small scale, comparatively, happening in the land, in the promised land. And then there's Jewish life happening in Babylon, and there's not very much connection between the two. There's very little connection. The connections we see are with Nehemiah, when he gets reports from his brothers who are part of the first return, and they report how sad everything is. Those are just a few of the only connections between the two that we see. And as I already mentioned, the synagogue system starts in Babylon and takes place there in the exile. And sort of just moving forward, Babylon in 539 BC, Babylon goes away in Medo-Persian. That empire begins in a single night in a dramatic story. We'll refer to that in a minute. An outline of Ezra. I think that the book is really divided into two major parts. The first part is really all about the building and sort of the dramatic events that unfolded. I sort of divided up the book into, for my outline, into 6 parts, and the last part is sort of generalized. So Cyrus's decree is chapter 1 of the book of Ezra, and then in chapter 2 we have the return chronicled. So we see a lot of details going into that return that help us understand that. Chapter 3 is temple rebuilding. It's about rebuilding the temple. And in chapter 4, we have building conflict. In chapter 4, building conflict. And then in chapters 5 through 6, we have building resumes and is confirmed. And that's Darius's confirmation that the people should be left untouched as they build the temple, commanding those who are surrounding them to leave them alone. So building resumes and is confirmed. That's chapters 5 and 6. And then from chapters 7 through 10, we have Ezra's memoirs, which really, this is where Ezra begins to lay out his particular, his influence on what is going on, his story. And we see that in chapters 7 through 10. I like Pastor Brian's outline, which is really simple. His outline is 2 parts. The first part is return to rebuild, and to return to rebuild the temple. And the second part is return to rebuild the priesthood. And I do like that. We've already talked about Cyrus's decree and the first return under Zerubbabel and Joshua, and we've touched on the temple building and the conflict. And a lot of this really is foundational for all of the books that we're talking about today, except for really Esther, because that's a different context than what's going on in the Promised Land. But all of this stuff is really kind of the foundation for, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, as well as Ezra and Nehemiah. So the Jews have the temple when it's completed, when it's finished, this little smaller version, but they don't have temple worship the way that the law demanded. So Ezra leads a return of priests, and this is really where Ezra's ministry comes into play. He leads a return of priests and Levites to go back and establish temple worship. Because what good is having a temple if it's not utilized the way that God intended, the way that the law stated it ought to be utilized? So that's Ezra's mission. He's leading a group of people back in the second return, and there's only 5,000 to 6,000 people that go in this group. It's a really small group that go back. And what we find is the majority of Ezra's ministry taking effect in chapters 7 through 10. One of the biggest issues that Ezra deals with is the issue of intermarriage. And he does this is, by the way, that meaning marriage to foreigners. So not just intermarriage among tribes or things like that, but outside people, particularly the people that were there dwelling in the land. The people had a big problem with that. The men were leaving behind their wives, and they were marrying these new prospects that they saw, and some of them were to establish certain deals with people. You can find that chronicled in Ezra. And then some of them were just out of the wickedness of their heart. But we can trace this idea of God's forbiddance of intermarriage all the way back to Exodus 34. In Exodus 34, 11 through 16, we see really God's heart for his covenant people to remain pure. We see this also in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4. They were not to intermarry. And God states his purpose in that. What's wrong with these other people? The main reason that God says this is because not only will the purity of the people as a group sort of dissolve, but specifically the idolatry of those people will be adopted. And that's consistently God's warning. We see that over and over again in Deuteronomy specifically, that if you do this and you intermarry, you will adopt their idols. And the danger that Ezra is facing here with this group of people, and Nehemiah addresses it as well. But the issue that they're facing is, oh no, we're going right back the same direction. You know, they're thinking in terms of, we just came out of this exile, and we were exiled for a reason. And we don't want to go back to that. We don't want to be judged by God again. And so they're really facing a dangerous situation in which the people are being led away by their own wicked hearts to intermarry. And they really, the danger they're facing is a return to the old way, adopting the idols of the surrounding nations. And so some people argue against this, saying, what about other biblical greats who had foreign wives, like Abraham, or Boaz and Ruth is another example of that. I think that in terms of Abraham is foundational for the nation, so it wasn't like there were a bunch of other Hebrews for him to go find and marry. But in the specific story of Boaz and Ruth, that is really an interesting story, and I think it's particularly encouraging for believers. Without going back to an overview of the book of Ruth, essentially, Ruth is a foreign woman, and her husband and her mother-in-law, Naomi, and their family really had dishonored the Lord by leaving. They weren't supposed to leave the land, but they sort of just wanted to escape and move away. So they moved away and intermarried. Their sons intermarried with foreign women. And Ruth is one of those foreign women. But Ruth makes a very distinct statement. When her mother-in-law, Naomi, is saying, God is repaying me for my evil, essentially, because she knows we weren't supposed to do this. We weren't supposed to go away. And Ruth says, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And she joins herself to her mother-in-law and vows to stay committed to her nation, and to her God. And when Boaz redeems her through the tradition of a kinsman redeemer type of transaction, it is really an amazing encouragement. It's not theologically positioned to be the proof for Gentiles being grafted in, but it serves as an encouragement that God does not only redeem one group of people for all eternity. And I think Ruth is an amazing example of that. But I think that is a specific instance where her heart, her humility, and her commitment to the nation and to God actually played a role in her significance and in her being joined in. And also in her marriage to Boaz. Now, there's really not other great exceptions to that. As far as the people after the time of the wandering in the wilderness, where God gave those instructions in Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's not really any great exceptions to the rule to go out and intermarry with other nations. So the concern that Ezra has is we're in danger of reverting back to the same thing that we got exiled for. And the holiness of God's people is incredibly important. That was really what was at stake, was the holiness of God's people. And that was something that it must not be compromised. It must not be compromised. Let's jump forward to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was a Persian king. And the circumstances for this are extraordinary, but we can really trace the probability of how he arrived at the cupbearer position. That is the most trusted position in the kingdom. I mean, the person that the king trusts the most is his cupbearer. It's not like a butler who just attends him. It's the very guy that is in charge of ensuring he's not assassinated through poisoning. And so it's the guy who puts his own life in front of the king's to taste and eat food and drink before the king to ensure it's not poisoned. So it's an extraordinary position, but we can trace this over to Esther. Artaxerxes is the stepson of Queen Esther. His father was Xerxes, or as the book of Esther calls him, Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus isn't a name as much as it is a title. So in the Persian kingdom, Xerxes could be called Ahasuerus Xerxes. Artaxerxes could be called Ahasuerus Artaxerxes because that was a title. And so that's why he's called Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. But that is, in the book of Esther, it was Xerxes. His son is Artaxerxes. And so because of what happened in Esther and in that story, it's not surprising that with Esther's influence as well as Mordecai's influence, who was promoted, it's not surprising that Nehemiah, because perhaps through their influence, that he reached a position of influence. Nehemiah's brothers were a part of the first return, and so they make a trip back to Persia in 445 BC to the palace. And Nehemiah says, basically, hey guys, how's it going? Probably with a excited heart, with cheer. He wants to know of the temple. He wants to know what it's like. What's it like to worship at the temple? But they give a sad report. They said that the place is a mess. It's trashed. The wall's in disrepair. Stuff's still burnt down. And on top of that, not only is everything a mess, but we're completely exposed. We are sitting ducks. So Nehemiah goes to the Lord in a really incredible prayer, a humble prayer. It's a very exemplary prayer that you'll be reading through. And he essentially approaches the Lord humbly and takes on the guilt of the people. Things that he probably was not guilty of, and he actually repents. And as he goes to the Lord in humility, he knows what he's about to do. He's about to risk his life for the people. And so he goes before the king, Artaxerxes, with a sad face, which was a huge no-no. You don't go before a Persian king with a sad face because they viewed themselves as so high and so important that if you ruined their happiness, you were deserving of death. And because he has this close relationship with Artaxerxes, I think that Artaxerxes almost looked at him as if to say, you know better than to do this. So what is it? What's your problem? and he says, he with this, goes in with a sad face and says that the place where my fathers are buried is in ruins. It's in ruins. So he gets permission to go back and to rebuild the wall. And Artaxerxes allows it. So he goes to Jerusalem, and the wall is built in 2 years. And you can still see part of that wall today if you go visit Israel and go on one of those trips. If you go into through the Jebusite tunnel, you can look back and see that. It's a great story, that part of Nehemiah. It's a great story of humility and faith. And then Nehemiah has permission to stay there. And so he stays there from 445 BC until 433 BC. And he stays until his time is up, and he has to go back to Persia for 10 years. He has to go back for 10 years. While he is gone, while he's back in Persia, everything goes south again. And so he goes back again to Jerusalem to institute some incredible reforms among the people. And Nehemiah actually serves as their governor. And his reforms coincide with what we will see in Malachi. I love Pastor Brian's outline, so I'm just going to give that one to you for Nehemiah. 2 sections. The first is rebuild the walls. That's chapter 1 through chapter 7, verse 3. Rebuild the walls. And then the second section is rebuild relationship with God. Rebuild relationship with God. And that's chapter 7, verse 4, all the way through the end of the book, which is chapter 13. Rebuild relationship with God. So similar to Nehemiah in the sense of there's important rebuilding of physical things, but there's also important rebuilding of spiritual things. Ezra's focus was rebuilding an important priesthood and temple worship. And Nehemiah, who is also concerned with temple worship, has him rebuilding the relationship with God. So Nehemiah's reforms, he was concerned with several things, with not only with proper worship in the temple, but he was also concerned with purity for the community. And he was concerned for, I don't like the term because of the way it's used now, but he was concerned for social justice among the people, because God's people were supposed to, in order with God's law, relate to one another in a certain way. And there were people who were beginning to go back to the old ways right before the exile of abusing the system. So his reforms struck at the abuse of the religious practices of the leaders who were there. And really, Nehemiah's reforms, if we're understanding this in light of the New Testament, in light of what's going on now, it helps us because his reforms demonstrate a struggle that would continue after his time between corrupt religious leadership and lay leaders who were concerned with purity and concerned with obedience to the law. And so the way that we see that continue is evidenced in unique groups of New Testament religious leaders, the Pharisees being on the lay leader side of things, and Sadducees. And the Pharisees countered the priestly power. And so there was a lot of division between the Pharisees and other religious leaders. But of course, that's easily overcome when they deal with Jesus. They get over their division and unite to put him to death. So Nehemiah, excellent book. His reforms are incredible, and the effect of those continue on through into the New Testament period.
I was going to ask that. Essentially, the idolatry did stop at this point, didn't it?
Yes.
From then on.
Yeah, so the issue of the idolatry with the intermarriage, because that's really where the idolatry was coming from. Essentially, that stopped, and his reforms were really successful. But what we find when we get to the intertestamental period is we find a certain group of people branching off, and we have a form that remains true, a group of people that were the traditionalists, and they remain true to the law. So his reforms were in effect over time, and they worked. But at some point, and this is during the Greek Empire, specifically, there were groups of people that decided that they loved the Greek culture, and they adopted some of the pagan worship and things like that. And I, if we can make it to the intertestamental period, I want to talk about that. But yes, the reforms were successful and sort of coincided with Ezra, who was also seeking that purity of the nation, refrain from intermarriage, and the measures that they took to enforce that were dramatic. Essentially, the men all had to divorce their their pagan wives and divorce all the foreign women right then and there, and leave them behind and return to the wives of their youth. And the ones who, which would have included the ones who had never married a Hebrew woman, would leave that one behind to go marry a Hebrew woman. And so the purity of the nation was incredibly important, not just for bloodline's sake, but more importantly for holiness' sake. And so we see those reforms being emphasized in both Ezra and Nehemiah. The main theme of Esther, when we get to the book of Esther, is God's providence. That is the theme, even though God's not mentioned, the temple's not mentioned, prayer's not mentioned. What we see, though, is we see God orchestrating everything. Pastor Brian's sermon series on the book of Esther is probably the most impactful thing that I've ever heard, or even come across, even in reading. Probably the most impactful thing I've come across outside of the Bible in helping me understand the book of Esther. It really is, his understanding of that is great, his insight into that is great, and it really paints a picture that kind of gets us outside of our modern Western way of thinking about the book of Esther and trying to apply certain things, and instead just seeing it for what it was, the book for what it was, the characters for who they were, and not trying to elevate someone to a status that they're not supposed to be. I think that there's a lot of devotionals and things like that, and a lot of people that have good intentions really trying to find a lot of virtues in Esther, and a lot of things to follow and emulate. And what Pastor Brian helped through his series helped me understand is that actually that's not the point of the book, is to emulate a lady. In fact, she's not really, we don't really find major evidence of her being virtuous. We do see certain elements of boldness, of courage, maybe even of faith, but she was the niece of a man who essentially brought her to a pageant to give her away to a foreigner, a Persian king. And it says a lot about Mordecai. I think there were some intentions in doing that to maybe try to gain some status, and that played into that. But really, the book of Esther shows that God is sovereign. The outline I have is in 4 parts, and they're all P's. So anytime that happens, I feel like I'm winning somehow. I don't know. The first one is the party. That's chapter 1 of Esther. Chapter 2 is the pageant. Chapters 3 and 4 are the problem. We come across the problem in the book of Esther that they face with Haman. And then chapters 5 through 10, we find the provision. So the party, the pageant, the problem, the provision. The key figures here are Xerxes, who is Ahasuerus. And by the way, Xerxes is he's the Persian king who waged war with the Greek city-states at that time in history. People know him because he was the one who fought against the Spartans, the Battle of the 300. That was Xerxes. He was the opposing force there, and so world history knows him as a real character. Queen Vashti, who was a bold queen, and she was killed for it. She does probably the most honorable thing that we see in the book, and that's refuse to dance naked before a bunch of men. And she was killed for it. But that's probably the most virtuous thing we actually find in the book. It's a very unique book. There's a lot of gore, especially when it comes to Haman and him being hanged on the noose that he prepared, which, by the way, that was not a hangman's noose like a rope. This is not like the Wild West days. I'm not going to describe the whole thing. Those were the gallows that he had prepared were spikes. And so now I'll stop there, but if you want to keep imagining that, you can. Esther and Mordecai are the Jewish figures there, and Haman, who's sort of the bad guy that we see in the book, he is actually an Edomite. And he was a descendant, which means he was a descendant of Esau. And knowing that helps us understand a little bit more why those two had such a deep hatred for one another that extended way more than just, oh, this guy won't bow to me. If you've ever read the book of Esther and been like, why are you so worked up if a guy doesn't bow to you? Well, I think that was the final straw. Edomites, the descendants of Esau, hated Jews. And the Jews hated the Edomites. So that is so the book of Esther, what we can understand from it is that God essentially uses a unique setting on a very grand scale at the very top in the palace to preserve the people who could have been wiped out. If the Jews had been wiped out, and you can imagine this in Persia, and the people surrounding the unguarded, sort of out there, totally exposed group of people in Jerusalem before it was fortified and rebuilt, you can imagine what the surrounding people would have done. They would have taken them out. And so the effect that has on our salvation is actually incredible. So it's good for us. And also, the Jews absolutely love the book of Esther. They love that book. They have a whole celebration, Purim.
That's where they boo and hiss and everything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Haman comes on.
Yeah, and they still do that to this day. They still have those celebrations. So let's breeze it through that's the historical books. Let's breeze through the prophets then. And I would say that all of the prophetic books have the common thread. So that's these three prophetic books, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They have the common thread of focusing intently on God's relationship with his people. So if we think of it this way, in the pre-exilic prophets, God's righteous judgment of the people and their unfaithfulness is the center. And in the post-exilic prophets, so that's in these three prophets, we see a shift because God's already executed his judgment. In these prophets, what we see is that God is rebuilding his remnant. And so he promises help in rebuilding. He promises healing and future prosperity. But this does not mean that the people are exempt from his judgment. And they have to be faithful to one another, and they have to be faithful to God. In essence, if we think of it this way, in the return, they're to reverse what led up to the exile. So they're to reverse that. And it's not just in terms of worship, it's also in social context as well, with how they are to treat one another, with who they can and can't marry, and they're really to reverse what happened. The post-exilic prophets call the people to complete devotion to God, but still the people keep messing up. They keep failing. The focus of the prophets on the temple is also different between pre-exilic and post-exilic prophets. In the pre-exilic prophets, the temple was taken for granted. Sacrifices were offered hypocritically. And that became a very severe source of frustration to God. And what we find in the post-exilic prophets in the return is that the temple became a vital focus for rebuilding the relationship that the covenant people had thrown away. And so the issue that was met, though, was different in the sense that the people after the return were apathetic. Their apathy became what these prophets addressed. They stopped rebuilding the temple. They used the building materials to furnish their own homes. And the priests were offering less than acceptable sacrifices to preserve the best for themselves. So the context of Haggai is really very straightforward. He is just, let's go straight to it. He's called the prophet who had a brick in one hand. So he was ready to preach to the people, but he was also ready to work. And his message was that we need to forge on, we need to rebuild, we need to rebuild our relationship with God because we are secure in God. We are secure in God. God will secure us, and he had tremendous faith in the Lord. So his was a message of challenge to the people of God's security if they will follow him and rebuild their relationship with him. But it was also an encouraging one as well. He has 4 sermons in his book. His first one is about rebuilding. His first one is about rebuilding. He basically says, you stole from the temple. You're using the stuff from the temple to pad your lifestyle. And he says, why are you trying to live your best life now? That's his message in his first sermon. He's saying, get back to work. You're using these things to pad your own lifestyle, and it's not honoring God. God's house is in shambles. And his questions that he asks, and basically, why do you think this stuff's not working out for you? You're doing all this stuff, but it's not profitable. Even the crops that you're growing are not as profitable. Nothing that you're doing is blessed by God because you're dishonoring God. In his second sermon, he preaches about a greater glory for the temple. So this was particularly encouraging with what we mentioned earlier, the sadness that surrounded the temple. Those who remember Solomon's temple, who had seen it, were filled with sadness. Well, Haggai gives a message of encouragement that there is a greater glory that is coming for the temple. Where we see that take place is when Herod adds on to this temple, essentially building on and making additions, and it is a glorious temple. But that is not the glory of that temple. The true glory of that temple is when Jesus walks in. And that is where Haggai's message of there is a greater glory for this temple than we can imagine. It is confirmed, and it takes place in Jesus. His third sermon is about promises of blessing, and his fourth sermon is about God's promises of victory. So these small prophets are great. They're really easy to kind of just read straight through. The 2 prophets that are really similar here are Haggai and Zechariah. Their messages are a little bit different though, but they are similar in some sense. Zechariah prophesies the same time as Haggai, but his message is less about the present, whereas Haggai's message is more about the present. And in some sense, Haggai talks about the future glory, but most of his message is about the present. Zechariah's message is very forward-looking. He's so much. He's got these visions and oracles, and it's really phenomenal to read through these. But there are so many mentions of things that are fulfilled in Jesus. For instance, I believe it's chapter 9. He talks about the king riding on the foal of a donkey. And in chapter 12, he talks about how the nation will look on him whom they've pierced. And these references we know are fulfilled in Jesus, but it's talking about, he's talking about one day when Israel will look upon God by clan and tribe and individual, and they will look on him whom they've pierced, and they'll mourn for him, and they'll trust in him by faith. And Paul talks about Israel, all of Israel being saved. And we know that to be something that happens in the future. That's part of Zechariah's message of a glorious future. He talks about how future false shepherds would kill the good shepherd. There's a lot of interesting, you'll read through it and see some references to what we understand to be Jesus. But he's very forward-looking in his prophecies. He gives encouragement for the present in chapters 1 through 9, and then promises for the future in chapters 10 through 14. He encourages construction of the temple, sort of like Haggai. They're encouraging the people, take heart, trust the Lord. God is with us. God secured us. We have a great future. All of these things were messages from God to encourage the people and get them to continue in the rebuilding. Because this period is absolutely critical for setting the stage for what takes place in the New Testament. And so the Lord is on their side. He's helping them even in the midst of their failures. As they start to turn down the wrong paths, often God comes in and helps them. So incredible messages in Zechariah. So when we think of the three prophets where Haggai and Zechariah encourage the construction of the temple, Malachi, when we get to Malachi, he evaluates the ongoing worship that's in the temple, that's built. So like the pre-exilic prophets, Malachi wishes to reform the abuse of worship. And so the day of the Lord became an important and consistent message that was really just meant to instigate a sense of urgency among the people. Malachi is a contemporary with the return of Ezra and Nehemiah, and he calls out the people for their complacency. They had become apathetic, and he calls them out. His message is about returning to God. And so, when we think of the prophets, the major and minor prophets, before and then after the exile, we're always finding them speaking from God to get the people to return to the Lord and be devoted to the Lord. And this addresses the forsaking of God that happened before the exile, and the complacency that the people held about God and worship of him after in the rebuilding stage. And so the people get a rough start. That's really what we see. It's a rough start to reestablishing and rebuilding. And all of this is done while they're underneath the control of another empire, the Persian Empire. And they don't get to have their own nation. In fact, not until 1948, when they are finally have their own nation. So they're always under empires up until that time. In Malachi, chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 16, we have the denunciation of Israel's sin. He denounces their sin. And he declares in chapter 2, verse 17 through chapter 4, he's declaring judgment and blessing through chapter 4, verse 6. And what we arrive at, and this is what I want to try to finish on because our time is already limited, but I want to touch on the intertestamental period before we have to leave. So I'm going to go for about, I think I can do this in about 10 minutes. Maybe.
Yep.
So
3 minutes, yeah, go for it.
the best way for us to look at the intertestamental period is to understand that Daniel prophesied back in Daniel chapter 2. He prophesied, meaning that he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So less of a prophecy, more of an interpretation. He interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream about an image. And we've already looked at that, so we're not going to go through the whole thing. But the dream itself, God revealed to be 4 kingdoms. 4 kingdoms. The first kingdom was Babylon, which began in 612 BC when they overthrew Assyria. And the kingdom lasted until 539 BC. And that was the night when Belshazzar threw that party and profaned the temple vessels at his party. God's hand wrote on the wall. That same night, the Medo-Persians had dammed up the aqueduct and just walked straight into the city. So that began the second kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and that's what we know as the Medo-Persian Empire, or just the Persians for short. King Darius is the Persian king who throws Daniel in the lion's den. King Cyrus, the Persian king, is the one who God used as anointed. Isaiah 44. Oh, this is where I have it. Jeremiah 25 and 29. Those 2 passages in Jeremiah are fulfilled in Cyrus. And then, of course, Isaiah 44. We have Xerxes. He's the one who waged the war with the Greeks. Also the husband of Esther. And then we have Artaxerxes, who we saw earlier that Nehemiah was his cupbearer. And Artaxerxes also waged war with the Greeks. And he eventually was not successful as the Greeks rose in power and the Persian Empire met its end in 331 BC. So this is after Malachi's last word was written. And we have this is the period of silence where God is not speaking. In the Greek Empire, we have Philip of Macedonia, who really wants world domination. That's his goal. And his son, Alexander the Great, takes on that task. And he's the next Greek ruler, and he eventually succeeds in controlling much of the known world, but he dies that night. The night that it's completed, he drinks himself to death and has alcohol poisoning. There's no qualified heir to the Greek Empire, so it splits into 4 parts based on 4 Greek generals. And 2 of those parts are of particular interest to Jewish history. 2 of those generals were Ptolemy and Seleucus, and they battled one another for the control of the land of Israel, basically. The Seleucids were the line of successors that took control of Israel, and they're known as the Antiochus line. And the Ptolemies, all of those successors were named Ptolemy. But the Antiochuses were the Seleucids. So Antiochus the Great finally took control of Israel, and it was a later Antiochus Epiphanes, who you've probably heard of. He called himself Epiphanes, and so that was a self-given name, which means one like God. He thought himself to be God. And it was he who outlawed temple worship. He outlawed temple worship. And there's this amazing story in Jewish tradition that Antiochus Epiphanes actually cut off all the supply of oil to the Jews. No oil. And the reason that's significant is because the lamps in the temple were supposed to burn with oil. And they were supposed to be refilled consistently and kept burning. And according to the story, it was 8 straight days where they had no supply of oil. There was no available oil. And the lamps, according to the story, never burned out for 8 straight days. Why do I bring that up? Well, because that's where the Jewish Festival of Lights comes from. That is called Hanukkah. And that's why the Hanukkah menorah has 4 posts on each side. And those 8 side posts represent the 8 days where the lamps continue to burn. So it's a little bit different than the regular temple menorah, which had 7 lights. So all of this happened when, around the time, it was a little bit after that event, that the Jews, led by Judas Maccabeus, revolted against Antiochus, and they won. But what instigated their revolt was a significant event. So Antiochus Epiphanes tried to end Judaism. He wanted to completely end it. And he did this in a really terrible way. As I mentioned earlier, there were Jewish traditionalists, those who followed the law and those who worshiped Yahweh. And then there were the Hellenists who took part in worshiping pagan gods. They accepted the Greek culture. They enjoyed that and wanted to fit in. He wasn't really worried about them. He was worried about the traditionalists because they were the Yahweh worshipers. And so he, in an effort to stamp out the Jewish faith, he ordered that all Jews have to worship Zeus. And he outlawed worship of Yahweh. So the traditionalists revolted. And Antiochus was aggravated, as an understatement, and he raided the temple in Jerusalem. He stole treasures, and he set up an altar to Zeus, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar and threw pig's blood. And when the Jews expressed their outrage, because it was just the most shocking thing that they could imagine, Antiochus responded by slaughtering many of them. So he killed a lot of the traditionalist Jews, and he sold others into slavery, and then he issued a couple really terrible decrees. One, that circumcision is punishable by death. And then another is that Jews everywhere were ordered to sacrifice to pagan gods and eat pig flesh. So it's just really, really wicked, very evil. And so the Jews revolted under Judas Maccabeus and eventually won. And so the temple was cleaned up and restored in 165 BC. So that the fourth kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar's dream is Rome. And Rome took power from the Greek Empire in 146 BC. So that's that fourth kingdom, Rome. And this empire brings us to the New Testament. So Julius Caesar places a guy named Herod as a sort of ruler, a king, to rule over the Jews. And Herod, interestingly, is an Idumean. Idumeans are descendants of Edom, and the Edomites are descendants of Esau. So he knew that, of course, the Jewish people hated Edomites, and so in an effort to make himself popular and more acceptable to the people, he builds them a temple. And really by adding on to Zerubbabel's temple, and that had been consistently, there had been little additions and additional furnishings and things like that over time, but he really made it much bigger, and it was a significant endeavor. And of course, that is the temple that Jesus visits. But that period of over 400 years where God is silent is broken in Luke chapter 1. So I'm just going to read, I just want to read that to close. Just to imagine this, in putting yourself in the place of a priest in the temple. Let's go to, here we go. A priest named Zechariah, in verse 8, Luke 1:8. Now, while he was serving as a priest before God when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. So remember, God has been silent for over 400 years, since Malachi. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense, and there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. So this is unbelievable. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." And that's the first time we have God speaking since Malachi. And so it's really moving to think about that, about what that would not only have meant for Zechariah, but what must have been rushing through his head, in that God has not spoken in hundreds of years, and he's speaking, And just the weight of that would have been incredible. So our time is up, but I'll pray and we'll be done. Lord, thank you so much for the time we've had here this afternoon, evening, to talk about history, to talk about your story that is laid out for us. And I thank you so much for your word, and that as we read it, we are able to learn more about you and more about the significance of your sovereign plan as you work all things together to give us the opportunity to know you. And so we thank you for these things in Jesus' name.